Hello and welcome back to Higher Voltage, a Volt podcast covering the latest trends in higher education marketing and administration. And with everything that's going on in the industry, there is a lot to cover. I'm your host, Kevin Tyler, an industry veteran, and I've worked on both sides of the fence at institutions like UCLA and various higher education agencies. In each episode, I talk to industry experts to get their take on what's working, what's not, and what has to change. Higher Voltage is produced by Volt, the go-to news source for higher education marketers and enrollment professionals. You can visit Volt at voltedu.com and subscribe to Higher Voltage on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts so you don't miss an episode.
Higher ed is facing headwinds like never before. And with internal teams leaner than ever, you need outside help that knows what you do and can plug into your operations to help in any way you need. From enrollment analysis and support, to bold, brand-driven creative and elite user-focused strategies, Electric Kite can help. So yeah, it's getting windy out there. But that's okay, because kites rise against the wind. Visit electrickite.com to learn more.
All right, welcome back to Higher Voltage. Listen, we took a couple of months off to celebrate the summer and the sun, so we're happy to be back today. I'm particularly excited about our conversation today about a trend that you might be familiar with. That is the decrease in male enrollees at college campuses across the country. Over the past 50 years, since the passing of Title IX, we've seen college campuses steadily become more female. My conversation with today's guest, Erica Levi Zelinger, author of No Country for Young Men, which is on our Volt website, released last week, will include a deep dive into her research on the trend and how universities might respond and, quite frankly, are responding to this trend and the decrease of men applying and choosing to attend college in 2025. Erica Levi Zelinger is a marketing and communications professional with nearly 2 decades of experience in higher education and destination marketing. Before transitioning into this work, she worked in magazine and print journalism, building a foundation in content strategy and storytelling that continues to inform her approach to engaging diverse audiences. Erica, thank you so much for joining me today on Higher Voltage.
Thank you for having me, Kevin. It's great to be here.
Of course. I wanted to start off, if you're okay with it, just a kind of a umbrella overall kind of table setting for what you have learned about this kind of phenomena around men not choosing to attend college in these recent years. This is not a new trend, of course, because it's been happening since 1972, but we do see that it is a much more pronounced kind of phenomena in higher education enrollment and admissions. Can you talk just kind of from a surface level about what this means for higher education?
Sure. I mean, a lot of it comes down to assumptions and cliches. I think brands tend to either default to outdated stereotypes, like the idea that young men only care about sports or toughness, or they avoid saying much at all because they're worried about getting it wrong. So I think younger men today are more diverse in their identities and interests, and they're also more skeptical of marketing. They can spot when a message is trying too hard or when it feels inauthentic. I think the challenge is finding ways to connect that feel genuine and that speak to, their actual aspirations or their values or even their anxieties without reducing them to a caricature.
And do you find that is what happens in higher education marketing already, that we have this like stereotypical kind of approach to how we include men in marketing materials? There are lots of kind of stereotypes that I think are leveled in higher education marketing. Is it the same for just like general population of men?
I think so. I mean, I don't think that it's all that different. I mean, I think, marketing kind of, spans the gamut. And so I don't think it's, any different when we're talking about men in higher ed versus, men in razors.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. In your article, you talk about how brands often miss the mark with younger men. From what you've seen, why do you think it's so hard to connect with them? Is it only the authenticity that you spoke about earlier, or are there other things to consider when we're marketing higher education to men?
I mean, I think the key is to avoid positioning a message as an attempt to fix men or to dictate what masculinity should look like. I think you have to lead with storytelling and examples that reflect the real diversity of men's experiences. You have to show how men's skills and perspectives are valued on your campus. You have to use inclusive language that focuses on contribution and purpose rather than identity labels.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I could not agree with you more. That's one of the things that I've been thinking about when preparing for our conversation and just kind of keeping a bit of a pulse on the trend in general, is that it becomes a very hard needle to thread to market to men without defining what masculinity and maleness is in America. I think that's going to be the hardest part about this for higher education. We've seen efforts around, places doing lumberjack kind of imagery and sports imagery, as you mentioned before, but not everyone falls in that category. And they are also included in this trend of the decrease in male enrollment.
Yeah, I think instead of saying, you can't just focus on the male enrollment from the gender balance issue. You have to expand on how you're saying it. So instead of saying we're looking to increase male enrollment in our elementary education program to create a better gender balance in our classrooms, you have to say something a little bit more poetic. Your leadership skills and mentoring experience can help inspire the next generation of learners, opening the doors to administrative and curriculum development opportunities. You can't be as blatant when you're reaching out to this population.
Mm-hmm. I think that's right. And I think that we've seen a lot of kind of initiatives kind of pop up across the country in hopes to respond or at least address the issue. We've got organizations that are specifically for Black male enrollment and retention, which is also obviously a part of this, but it impacts the Black male population a bit more significantly. We have initiatives that are around mental health. We have initiatives that are around other parts of the male experience that higher ed might be able to impact or influence. And I think that it's an interesting kind of response that there are different topic areas that these kinds of initiatives are going after, like the mental health, et cetera. Do you see other examples across the country that you find to be kind of exciting when it comes to marketing to men for higher ed?
I mean, I think there's definitely kind of a narrative now more so around connecting with the young men who are in this time period of, being willing to experiment. I think community colleges and trade schools are doing more with showcasing career pathways and personal transformation stories featuring male students, especially in industries like education and healthcare where men are underrepresented.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that I was thinking about that exact thing where there's a push in the education space to obviously get more male teachers, including more Black male teachers as well. And what that means is that we have to message in a way that is compelling enough for a person to entertain becoming a teacher. And so I think too, I agree with you that this is not about traits of masculinity. It's about what the message is and who I am as a person coming to a campus, what I have to give and contribute, and what I can get from the institution that's going to make the most difference. I think that the kind of the tropes that we see are going to be more short-term wins. In the long run, I think is going to bite us in the back.
Absolutely. When you give men room to see themselves in the narrative without prescribing who they should be, then it's going to come across as more authentic and respectful.
The piece that you wrote last week, which, by the way, is necessary to read for anyone listening to this episode of Higher Voltage, it was just released last Wednesday, I believe. And you speak about an organization, the national organization that Kelly from University of Montana is a part of.
Yes. And I'm going to pull it up too, just so I get it right. It's the Higher Education Male Achievement Collaborative.
What did you learn, if you could share more around that initiative and how they are approaching some of the issues here?
I mean, I think it was about learning that you need to balance the career readiness and the meaningful living and the well-being and the leadership behind the student's experience rather than just their maleness.
Uh-huh.
And I think that was something that Kelly Nolan took away and wanted to be a part of when she was working at University of Montana and was recognizing that they were, losing male enrollment, and she was trying with her team to address it head on. their initial strategy was to market to men by emphasizing, the ruggedness of Montana itself and things like outdoor adventure and the landscape and the frontier. And it was rooted in these traditional ideas of masculinity, positioning the university as, outdoorsy and physically challenging.
Mm-hmm.
But I think what was so interesting is when they saw that the message wasn't connecting with young men they were trying to reach, they were willing to pivot. They wanted to switch gears and figure out how can we reach men in a different way.
Yeah. I think University of Montana is one of the case studies that I often go back to because they are quite nimble in their approaches to marketing when needed and when necessary. And I think that your article, which paints the picture that their first year only kind of resulted in a 2.8% increase in male enrollment, means that we have to try some other kinds of things. And one of the things I am hopeful for higher education, especially at this time, is this willingness to be nimble and the willingness to be flexible with solutions. If we see it's not working at the outset, we have an opportunity to change the approach so that it becomes a bit more of a significant effort.
Absolutely. And, she elaborated on, making sure that you're testing that message with the audience, even if it's a small focus group within the office space, get their feedback early rather than making those assumptions that, your campaign is working, because this was what was working for them or what they thought was working based on the data. And then they were able to switch gears, fairly quickly and take a different approach and see it in a different light as a result of the findings. And I think that was really important, that they didn't just continue with the path because they thought it was the right thing to do, because then
Right.
it just becomes rote and tedious and it's not helping anyone.
Yeah, 100%. I think the other component to this that is, I think, just as important as the enrollment message is the retention message. What we know is that even if male students do, in fact, choose to go to college, they leave at a higher rate than women do. And so the retention experience for college or university brand is going to be just as important as you getting them there is going to be to keep them there.
Awesome.
And I'm not really sure of any initiatives off the top of my head that are really doing an excellent job of the retention piece. Are you familiar with any by any chance?
I cannot think off the top of my head, because I think, retention is just an ongoing challenge,
Right.
in today's higher ed market in terms of how to, keep the student there. Some of it is based on finance. Some of it is based on the approach you took to get them there. But it's an ongoing challenge that I think colleges and universities across the country are struggling with.
Yeah. From where we sit today, what do you consider to be some of the long-term impacts or consequences to this decrease in men choosing to attend college?
I think we're looking at something that goes, beyond enrollment numbers, because if we keep missing the mark with young men, they're going to continue to check out. And I don't just mean from higher ed. They're going to, we're talking about civic participation and community involvement, all of it. So here's the thing, when people don't feel seen or valued, they're going to withdraw. So if we keep sending the message that we don't really care about their successes, then it's just going to continue. Those numbers are going to continue to get worse. So long term, we're looking at, even wider gender gaps in education and professional fields. And I think it's bigger than that. We're talking about, building healthy communities where everyone is feeling like they have a stake in the outcome. But if you have a whole demographic that feels disconnected, then it's a problem for all of us. If we keep alienating them, we're shooting ourselves in the foot.
Mm-hmm.
I think we need everyone at the table if we're going to solve complex problems around, healthcare or education or climate change, what have you. You can't do that when half the population feels like they're not welcome.
Totally. I also wonder about kind of the long-term consequences for, as you mentioned, community, also community building and families. And if we have a really excellently educated female population, will it be harder for them to find a mate, and what that means for birth rates and what college has to deal with in the future in terms of, we saw a birth dearth in 2008 with the financial decline, economic decline. And we're seeing one right now. And if we have another kind of component to factor into how society continues, there is going to be a reduction or doesn't, right? The reduction in suitable mateship might be impacted by this as well. It's one of the kind of predictions from, I don't know, about 8 or 9 years ago, which I still think about when thinking about this trend of the decrease in men attending college.
Mm.
I'm curious what else you may have learned in your research for your article that you wrote that might be of interest to our listeners.
When I was talking about University of Montana and what they were doing well, I started delving a little bit deeper to kind of what other schools and colleges were trying that might be different than like the larger scale schools. And I think community colleges and trade schools were doing a really good job of showcasing like their career pathways. University of Maryland School of Nursing has a page right off their admissions website that showcases like the historical and contemporary male nursing success stories. And I think this exemplifies this positive achievement focused approach. It presents nursing as an opportunity for meaningful contribution, and it reframes that male participation isn't just solving this problem, that like we're bringing men into this field. Connecticut State Community College is doing something similar where they have a page that's dedicated to men in nursing.
Mm-hmm.
Again, specifically addressing male students, interested in nursing careers. And I think these pages are normalizing men in these fields. They're showing real faces and real stories and emphasizing career purpose rather than the novelty of men in the field. And I think these sites are keeping it kind of aspirational without implying that men are lacking something to be in nursing or they need different treatment to be in nursing. So I think, these community colleges and trade schools are doing something a little bit different than large universities and colleges in terms of how they are marketing to and interacting with current students or prospective students and current students.
Student deportations, suspended research grants, penalizations for DEI initiatives, and that's just this week. These and a whole raft of other legal questions and challenges are redefining higher education every day. That's where our new podcast, Campus Docket, comes in. I'm Scott Schneider, an attorney and adjunct professor at the University of Texas School of Law. And in every episode of Campus Docket, I'll be joined by Eric Kelderman, senior writer at the Chronicle of Higher Education, to break down the latest legal issues that higher ed leaders need to know about, from slash funding to rules regarding NIL and student athletics and everything in between. Tune into Campus Docket, part of the Volt podcast network, as we help you navigate higher ed's thorny legal issues.
Yeah, I think there's quite a bit that traditional four-year institutions can learn from community colleges and trade schools. It's always been a fact, I think, especially in the marketing component, because it feels so much closer to local communities than it can often feel like.
Mm-hmm.
And this notion specifically around attracting men to college is one of those examples of that fact as well.
It's more stormy weather for higher ed. It's not just about the gender gap.
Exactly. Say more about that.
I mean, you talked about it. We're hitting this enrollment cliff. Birth rates are dropping dramatically from the 2008 recession on. So there's fewer 18-year-olds coming through the pipeline. And then, back to the article, the numbers have basically flipped. Back in 1970, men were around 57% of college students and women were around 43%, and now that's reversed. So if the current trends continue, that gap is only going to widen, and we're dealing with fewer students overall and the growing gender imbalance. So it's just becoming really, really pronounced. And it's like, where do you go from here? What do you do? What does this mean, practically? And I think we're going to see universities scrambling to try and reinvent themselves.
I think you're 100% correct on that. And I'm hopeful that many of them can do it in time. It makes me nervous to think about those who might be coming to this issue new, or any of the other issues that are forcing a reinvention in the higher education space. We are in a moment of necessary action for the entire industry. And there are so many things that need to be responded to that it's hard to figure out which one to do first, which one to do next, which one will change. It just feels like an industry that it feels untethered right now, which is unfortunate.
Absolutely.
I'm curious, though, if you could predict what the next 5 or 10 years might look like in higher education. This is a question I ask every guest that comes through the proverbial doors of higher voltage, what they will look like from your perspective.
Like I said, their colleges are going to be trying to reinvent themselves. I think right now, some of the growth might be happening with the older student population, people in their 20s and 30s who are going to and graduating from college later in life. So I think the traditional model of the 18-year-olds going straight to college is becoming less dominant. And that's something that universities will need to shift their, marketing attempts with. And then I suspect we're going to see more institutions doing what some of the community colleges are already doing, like really leaning into that career pathway, story approach. Instead of the generic come and get your degree messaging, they need to say, like, here's how this nursing program, changed Kevin's life, or meet Steve, who went from factory work to becoming a teacher. I think there's going to be continued growth in online and hybrid programs too, which actually could open up the possibility for reaching some of these men who might not have considered traditional colleges, but are still interested in, more of the skills-based learning. But I think the schools that survive this are going to be the ones that pivot quickly, like less ivory tower mindset, more of here's how we can solve this career problem. I think it's going to be much more like a pragmatic approach, results oriented. But I think the hardest thing and the biggest thing is that they need to start now. They needed to start yesterday.
Right. I can't think of like what some of the first indications were before this became kind of a more mainstream issue. I'm curious, like, when do you think it became problematic, right? Like, when did the decrease kind of raise alarm bells?
Another good question, and I'd have to go back to the data, but at least 10 to 15 years ago, I think there was, a shift that they were starting to realize, but they didn't necessarily pay attention to either what was causing it or kind of think like larger scale of how it was going to affect the future. And so they just kind of went along with status quo, and they can't do that. And it's just been like this flat line, and then a stark drop. And now we're, in this era of struggle across the board. And can we come back from here is the big question.
That is the big question. And that's the big question that ends most of the conversations we have on higher voltage these days about higher education and whatever trend we're talking about, whether it's funding, men in college, retention. Can we come back from this? And I think that it's an industry that can, but it has to do some things much differently than it ever has before. We're in an era of constant reinvention right now, and it's going to take constant forward motion to respond to some of these issues. Where can people find you to learn more about your work? I know you're on LinkedIn, of course. We'll have a link to that on our episode page. Where other social media outlets or platforms are you available on?
I'm on LinkedIn mostly. I'm still on Facebook because I'm an old head, and on Instagram, but I'm much more of a follower than a poster.
Okay.
So mainly follow me on LinkedIn.
Got you. We'll have a link to the wonderful article that Erica released last week on our episode page as well as some other resources about this trend. Erica, thank you so much for joining us on Higher Voltage. We will keep an eye on this, of course, and I would love to have you back to respond to any sort of changes we see in this phenomena around men in college. But until then, thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Kevin. This was a pleasure. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks for listening to this week's episode of Higher Voltage. You can stay up to date on the latest higher ed marketing trends and news by following Volt on LinkedIn and Blue Sky. You can find me, Kevin Tyler, on Blue Sky as well. We'll be back soon with another episode. And don't forget to catch Trusted Voices, hosted by my friends Teresa Valerio Parrott and Aaron Hennessy, also on the Volt Network.